Imagine being Rome's most powerful senator only to find yourself dressed in rags, chained like a criminal, paraded before a crowd not for justice, but for sport. And behind the curtain, applauding with delight, is the emperor himself. Nero didn't just rule with fear, he ruled with theater. To him, death wasn't punishment. It was art. He burned nobles alive to light his garden, forced poets to kill themselves while singing praises to him. He didn't just destroy his enemies, he curated their suffering. This is the terrifying story of how Rome's elites became playthings for an emperor obsessed with control, humiliation, and spectacle. Before Nero became a tyrant, he was a boy in a palace soaked with secrets and shadows. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was ambitious, cunning, and ruthless, a woman who survived exile, poisonings, and assassinations to put her son on the throne. His uncle was Caligula, the mad emperor who turned Rome into a blood circus. And young Nero? He watched, he listened, he learned. In the marble corridors of imperial Rome, he witnessed things no child should see. Guards tortured men in the basements below the banquet halls. Senators vanished after casual remarks. Servants were whipped for broken plates. Caligula killed for amusement, once laughing as a man was executed mid-feast. Agrippina, in contrast, used seduction and manipulation like weapons. To her, love was leverage. Nero absorbed it, unemotionally starved, morally unmoored, and surrounded by death disguised as duty. His lessons were not in philosophy or law, but in power, fear, and silence. He learned how a smile could mask betrayal, how mercy was weakness, and how the only way to be safe was to be feared. As a boy, he wasn't yet a monster, but he was watching them being made. He studied the games his mother played, the cruelty Caligula wielded like a blade, and the strange thrill in watching others suffer. By the time he was old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, that difference no longer mattered. He had already been taught something else. In Rome, the only thing more dangerous than being hated was being ignored, and he would never be ignored again. At 16, Nero became the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. But he didn't take the throne with a warrior's grit or a philosopher's wisdom. He took it like a puppet, with his mother pulling the strings and Rome holding its breath. Agrippina had schemed for years to place her son at the center of power, seducing the Emperor Claudius, marrying him, and allegedly poisoning him when he'd outlived his use. The moment Claudius died, Nero ascended young, handsome, and silent behind wide, uncertain eyes. At first, Rome was relieved. The empire had seen madness before, and Nero, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the general Burrus, appeared controlled, almost benevolent. Public executions paused. Taxes were eased. Bread and games flowed. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Nero was not content to rule, he wanted to feel powerful. And there was one obstacle that stood as a threat: Britannicus, Claudius's biological son. A true heir, older than Nero, sharper, respected. During a royal banquet, Britannicus took a sip of wine and collapsed before the court, gasping, twitching, dying in front of hundreds. Nero sat still, calm, smiling faintly as chaos erupted. No one dared accuse him. No one even whispered it. The message had been delivered clearly. The child emperor had teeth. That night, Nero slept soundly for the first time. Killing hadn't terrified him, it had thrilled him. He hadn't just removed a rival, he'd made a statement. Power, he realized, wasn't something you earned. It was something you took. And if Rome wouldn't love him for his rule, they would learn to fear him for his silence. The boy who watched too much had become the emperor who acted without blinking, and his hunger had just begun. Nero never craved to be remembered as a great ruler, he wanted to be adored as a performer. The throne meant little compared to the stage. He fancied himself a singer, a poet, a god of art trapped in a world of politics. The Senate scoffed. The elites whispered. They clapped because they had to, not because they meant it. And Nero heard it all. So he decided to give them a show they'd never forget. He began staging private performances, forcing Rome's elite to attend. They watched him act in tragedies, sing in foreign tongues, and recite long poems written in his own honor. To not applaud was treason. To leave early was death. But eventually, Nero grew bored with recitals. Words weren't enough. He wanted real emotion, real agony. So he turned to executions not as punishments, but as performances. He began dressing prisoners as mythological figures and staging public executions that mirrored ancient tragedies. A man playing Hercules was mauled by a lion before a roaring crowd. A noblewoman, cast as Iphigenia, was sacrificed on a faux altar in a temple garden. Their screams were woven into the music, their deaths choreographed to match Nero's twisted vision. It was no longer enough to destroy his enemies. He needed them to die beautifully, to bleed in rhythm with his applause. His cruelty was no longer random, it was curated. And the elite, once confident in their wealth and status, now lived in fear of being cast in Nero's next tragic masterpiece. The emperor had found his favorite art form, and in his theater, there were only two roles left to play: the audience or the victim. The palace halls grew quieter, colder. The laughter of poets and the clever barbs of senators faded into silence. One by one, the brightest minds of Rome disappeared, not in war, not by accident, but by invitation to dinner. Nero's favorite tool was no longer the sword, it was the chalice. With each passing year, the emperor grew more paranoid, more consumed by shadows. Anyone who inspired admiration became a threat. Anyone praised for talent, intelligence, or beauty was suspect. His former tutor, Seneca, once admired as a voice of wisdom, now walked carefully, knowing the boy he'd raised had become a man who measured friendship in usefulness. Nero didn't confront his enemies. He erased them. Petronius, the arbiter of elegance, was ordered to die not for treason, but for style. His wit, his grace, his subtle mockery had outshined the emperor's own performances. Lucan, the poet, was forced to open his veins and recite verses as he bled out, offering his final breath to a man who envied every word. Even Seneca was not spared. Accused of vague conspiracies, he was sentenced to a slow, ceremonial suicidian old man, cutting his veins while his wife watched. Poison became protocol. Suicide, theater. Nero didn't just want them dead, he wanted them to surrender, to acknowledge his control in their final breath. The noble courts, once filled with voices and ambition, now echoed with forced confessions and quiet sobs. And through it all, Nero watched. Not with rage, but with satisfaction. Each death fed the illusion that he was untouchable, that no one, no matter how wise or beloved, could steal the spotlight from him. But the spotlight casts long shadows, and Rome was starting to whisper again. In July of 64 AD, Rome caught fire, and with it, whatever remained of Nero's restraint turned to ash. The blaze raged for 9 days, devouring homes, temples, and marketplaces. Thousands were left homeless. Entire districts vanished beneath smoke and rubble, and while the city burned, rumors spread like sparks. Nero had set the fire himself. Some claimed he watched from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction as his own capital crumbled. True or not, what mattered was perception, and Rome was furious. Faced with outrage, Nero did what he always did, turned the tragedy into a performance. He declared himself the city's savior, ordered grand reconstruction plans, and unveiled blueprints for a lavish palace at the heart of the devastation, the Domus Aurea, a golden house rising from the ruins. But that wasn't enough to silence suspicion. He needed a scapegoat. First, he blamed the Christians, strange, secretive, and already despised. They were arrested by the hundreds, tortured, mutilated, and executed in public displays meant to distract and entertain. But even that wasn't enough. So Nero looked inward at the elite. Nobles were accused of arson, betrayal, and conspiracy. Trials were rushed, evidence forged, and executions staged with the grandeur of public theater. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and burned alive at night to light Nero's garden parties. What had once been private cruelty became public ritual. Nero had discovered a new kind of power, not just in killing, but in making the entire empire watch. The fire had consumed Rome, but it had awakened something in him even more dangerous. Now, death was no longer punishment, it was policy and performance. By nightfall, Nero's gardens glowed not with lanterns or torches, but with the burning bodies of the condemned. Guests arrived in silk and jewels, expecting wine and music. Instead, they were greeted by human torches, Christians, nobles, and alleged conspirators, smeared with pitch and nailed to crosses, their flesh crackling in the firelight. Nero called it illumination. The guests called it survival. To look away was to invite suspicion. To speak against it was suicide. This was no longer justice. It was theatre of the grotesque. In the private courtyards of the Domus Aurea, Nero staged mock hunts with naked senators cast as wild beasts. Prisoners were dressed as tragic figures from mythology, then killed in reenactments that blurred legend and reality. A nobleman might be tied to a stake and devoured by trained animals for the emperor's amusement. A courtier might be forced to recite poetry while his tongue was slowly removed. Each act more creative, each death more degrading. The laughter of Rome's highest echoed through the horror, but it was nervous, fragile. Everyone knew their place in the garden could shift at any moment from guest to victim. To Nero, these executions were not cruelty, they were art, carefully choreographed, emotionally timed, and brutally unforgettable. He walked among the flames like a god admiring his creation, intoxicated by the heat, the screams, and the silence of those too afraid to stop him. The garden had once symbolized peace and pleasure. Now, it was a temple of fear and open wound, where power fed on pain. And that image was only growing more divine. The Domus Aurea. Nero's golden house was less a palace and more a monument to delusion. Sprawling across central Rome, it shimmered with ceilings encrusted in gems, halls inlaid with ivory, and fountains that poured perfume instead of water. The dining rooms rotated like the heavens, and frescoes of gods adorned the walls. But within this glittering temple, Nero crowned a new deity himself. He no longer saw himself as a man, or even as an emperor. He was Apollo reborn, the sun, the artist, the divine arbiter of beauty and punishment. And just as gods demanded sacrifice, Nero demanded suffering. Executions within the palace became ritualized acts of worship. Noble victims were chosen for their beauty, their talent, their closeness to praise. Their deaths were staged not in dungeons, but in mosaic halls, beneath painted skies. One senator was forced to sing Nero's praises while being disemboweled. A noblewoman, too admired for her poise, was bound and slowly bled, while musicians played beneath golden arches. Pain became sacred. Silence became blasphemy. To live in Nero's Rome was to kneel to his madness, or be crushed beneath it. Artists were summoned to immortalize the executions. Poets wrote elegies to the condemned at sword point. Sculptors carved statues of the dying in graceful poses. Nero didn't just kill, he created. Every death was a signature, every scream, a note in his divine symphony. And the more the elite suffered, the more Nero believed in his godhood. He didn't want control, he wanted worship. But while he buried himself in gold and glory, the empire outside began to rot. Starvation rose, rebellions whispered, loyalty faded. The god in the golden house had surrounded himself with beauty, but he hadn't noticed the cracks beneath the gold. Beneath the glittering marble of Nero's Rome, rebellion festered like a wound. The emperor had turned the elite into prisoners and execution props, but some still remembered who they were. Led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and respected senator, a circle of conspirators formed a blend of noblemen, generals, poets, and even members of Nero's own court. Their plan was daring and clear: kill the emperor, restore sanity, and reclaim the soul of Rome. But in a world ruled by paranoia, silence was hard to maintain. A freedman, fearing guilt by association, exposed the plot before the dagger ever reached Nero's throat. The fallout was instant and savage. What followed wasn't investigation, it was slaughter. Nero unleashed a reign of terror so widespread it made his earlier purges seem restrained. Conspirators were dragged from their homes, tortured in public, and executed without trial. Some were crucified in front of their families. Others were forced to commit suicide under watchful eyes, their deaths recorded like stage directions in one of Nero's sick dramas. Lucan, the poet, died reciting verses about his own blood seeping into the earth. Piso, defiant to the end, slit his wrists in a public bath, refusing Nero the pleasure of begging. Even those tangentially connected to the plot were hunted down and silenced. Nero called it justice. Rome called it madness. But behind Nero's triumph, something had shifted. The fear he once inspired had curdled into hatred. The Senate no longer flattered, they endured. The people no longer cheered, they tolerated. And the elites, once willing to kneel, now sharpened their knives in secret. Nero had survived the conspiracy, But the performance was growing stale, and the audience was beginning to leave. As the empire groaned under the weight of famine, rebellion, and fear, Nero performed one last time. Draped in silk, his voice cracking with desperation, he stood on a private stage and sang of fallen heroes, of doomed lovers, of gods who died alone. No one dared interrupt. Not out of reverence but out of exhaustion. The emperor had become a ghost of his former self, pacing gilded halls, while the world outside crumbled. The Senate had seen enough. When word came that generals were declaring loyalty to rivals, that provinces were slipping through Nero's fingers, they acted. Nero was declared a public enemy and enemy of Rome. His guards deserted him. Servants vanished. For the first time in his life, Nero was alone. He fled the palace in disguise, hiding in a decaying villa on the city's edge, surrounded by a few loyal slaves too afraid to leave. There, in the dim glow of a dying oil lamp, he begged for someone to take his life. None could, so he took the blade himself. As Roman soldiers closed in, Nero pressed a dagger to his throat, hesitated, and whispered his final line. "What an artist dies in me." A final performance, staged only for himself. He died without glory, without honor, and without applause. The man who turned death into theater could not escape his own final act. No mourners gathered, no tomb was built. His body was hidden, buried quietly to avoid public desecration. The curtain fell not on a god, but on a broken man lost in the echoes of his own madness. And Rome exhaled. But the silence left behind was not peace, it was the stillness that follows when horror finally stops and memory begins. Nero's body decayed in an unmarked grave, but his shadow never left Rome. In the years that followed, rumors spread that he still lived, that he had escaped east and would one day return. Some believed him a god, others a demon, but all remembered him. Impostors arose, claiming his name, his voice, his face, and disturbingly, some were welcomed. Because Nero had done something no emperor before him had achieved. He had fused cruelty with spectacle. He didn't just wield power, he made people watch him wield it. He turned executions into opera, punishment into poetry, and for the elite, who once thought themselves untouchable, he shattered that illusion forever. Rank no longer mattered. Nobility no longer shielded. Nero taught Rome that any one poet, senator, philosopher could become a victim, and worse, be made to die beautifully. His successors studied him. Some feared his memory, others mimicked it. Domitian, Commodus, Caracalla drew from the same well of spectacle and suppression. Nero had written the script for imperial terror, and though the actor changed, the performance endured. The Domus Aurea was buried beneath new structures, its golden walls hidden from view, as if Rome itself tried to forget. But the cracks remained, the fear lingered, and in every trembling senator's smile, in every staged trial, in every theater rebuilt near his ruins, Nero's ghost watched. He had ruled not just by law, but by fear, illusion, and obsession. And centuries later, his name still echoed when power was abused, when truth bowed to theater, and when the powerful made a spectacle of suffering. He died without a crown, but ruled eternal as a warning. Not of what emperors can debut, of what people will accept when horror wears a mask of performance.